this was a really good opportunity for me is that I've spent my career thinking about a lot of the issues that I'm going to talk to you all today about, but it was almost always in the context of an individual policy, an individual regulation pertaining to an individual industry, and this was an opportunity for me to think about things a lot more broadly and how everything came together. I want to, at the outset, acknowledge my colleague who contributed to putting this presentation together and has done a lot of work with me in recent years that underpins this presentation, Tina Saitone. So one of the things I want to say at the outset is that in many ways the stakes are great for us in terms of getting policies and regulations correct. The things that are on this first slide are probably no surprise to most of the people in this room, but I don't think it's as widely understood and appreciated among the general public as it should be. I mean, we need to double agricultural production by 2050, and we're not on a pace to do it by any stretch of the imagination. So, we need to have in place policies and regulations that are going to make our agriculture more effective and productive, and we can't really afford to tie its hands if we're going to accomplish what we need to do. And while we're being challenged to produce more products, we're being challenged to produce an ever-widening array of them. As consumers' preferences become more diverse, consumers are able to afford to indulge their other passions in their eating besides merely getting enough nutrition. We're being asked to produce things in an environmentally sustainable way and ways that are consistent with our social objectives. We're now being asked to produce things in a way that's fair and so forth. So one of the things, as I go through this talk, the way I approached it in thinking about things myself is harken back to the now fairly long time ago that I was a graduate student, and what I was taught then about what was unique about agriculture and what was essential in terms of supporting agriculture and caused us to think differently about agriculture than we would other industries. So, what makes it different, and why do we intervene differently in our agricultural industries than we do in others? And I want to think about those arguments as they were originally raised 30 or so years ago when I might have studied these things as a student versus today. Things have changed dramatically, I think, over that period of time, and I think one of the challenges that our conventional wisdom may not be true today and may be leading us astray in some ways. So certainly one thing that's true, was true then and is true now about agricultural production, it's a random variable. I think it's the only industry where a producer sets out at the start of a production period and doesn't know what he or she is going to be producing at the end of that period. Any other industry, they produce what they want to produce, and that's not true with agriculture. Supplies and demands for agricultural products invariably are highly inelastic. That was true then, it's true now. Any industry that I've studied, it seems the demand is highly inelastic, and for good reasons. But the predicate to that, which is that farm prices and incomes are highly volatile, has driven a lot of our policy. And I'm going to question whether that's as important today as it was 30 or even more years ago. We've been led to believe that agricultural products are fundamentally undifferentiated and homogeneous. Everybody's in the same boat. That's been the traditional belief. I'm going to argue that that's fundamentally not true today in ways that are very important for how we think about our policies. And then we come to the notion of this fundamental asymmetry of power in the marketplace between farmers and downstream buyers. That has long been a concern. Lots of policies and regulations are driven by this concern. In many ways, this concern might be even greater today, but I'm going to argue to you that things are a little bit different than we might commonly think, or even different than I might have thought myself 20 or so years ago. And then lastly, the importance of agriculture to the national interest. No question that that's true, but I think the ways that we think about its importance has changed. So let me start by talking about what I consider to be the key conditions that define our modern agricultural markets and that thus need to be front and center as we think about agricultural policies and regulations. So the first thing I want to talk about is this notion of ever increasing dimensions of product quality that really hasn't been the case in the past. I mean, obviously the physical product qualities have always mattered. How a product looks, how it tastes, that matters today. Arguably it matters even more as people's incomes have risen to the point where they can indulge whatever attributes they seek in food products. But now we care about its environmental attributes, how it's produced, even the environmental attributes of how it's consumed. Is it green? Is it sustainable? Does it involve GMOs, pesticides? For animal products, increasingly people care about how those animals are treated. It's a very big deal as an emerging issue in the US for major corporations like McDonald's and so forth, questioning production practices involving gestation crates for hogs, cages for chickens, et cetera, et cetera. These are not things we talked about 20 or 30 years ago. What about the location of production? Well, in one case, it's cool or country of origin labeling. That really didn't seem ever to catch on too much, although there's still some interest in it. But the real topic of interest nowadays is local production. Local in the sense of however you define it, 100 or so miles for some people from where they live. We have a session on this conference pertaining to it. It seems like it's really catching on and it's really becoming important, but I don't think we're thinking about the macro implications of this type of local production and what we need to do to facilitate it and to encourage it and what it means in terms of our ability to produce products for this world population that's growing ever so rapidly. And then lastly, fairness. We didn't talk about fairness in marketing arrangements. Certainly now we're all familiar with concepts such as fair trade, rainforest alliance, which are all devoted to getting a better deal for producers in developing countries. I think the new frontier of fairness, at least as it pertains in my home state of California, is going to be the treatment of farm workers. I think increasingly we're going to see major downstream marketers, retailers, and so forth demanding that farm workers be treated in a certain way, and that's not something that we've dealt with in the past. Secondly, and a key element of my talk today is going to be the emphasis on heterogeneity, not homogeneity. So again, homogeneity was one of the issues. Farm products are identical. What one farmer produces is the same as what another farmer produces. That's probably never been true, but we've thought and acted as if it were true. And it's definitely not true today in ways that are increasingly important. People increasingly, whether it's farmers or marketers, are seeking to differentiate themselves, and the breadth of what consumers care about now in their food consumption makes it possible for them to do so. And a very important facet of these emerging dimensions of product quality attributes is that they're what we call credence attributes. The way a product looks and tastes and so forth are things that we can search for or we can experience in our own consumption. But if it's a consumer that cares whether the animal that produced that product was raised and treated in a humane manner, or if it's a consumer that cares that the product she's consuming was produced in a way that was environmentally friendly or sustainable in some sense, then that consumer can't tell that. So if these attributes are going to flourish and take hold, and enough people care that it seems that they will and probably should, then we need mechanisms to certify the credence of these claims. Is that going to be national governments, local governments, industry associations? collections of consumers, but without those products having their credence certified so that these claims are believable, they don't have any meaning. And so the question then is, are all of our policies and regulations that traditionally have been predicated upon agricultural products being alike, being homogeneous, are those things still valid today, or do we need to be thinking about things in quite a different way? As I said, we've long been concerned about market power in agriculture. And by any measure, we should be ever greater concern, because across all of the food chain in most, if not all countries, we have increasing consolidation, whether it's in the processing sector, the retailing sector, even in the farm sector, of course. The most important element in this aspect of consolidation and concentration, though, is the emergence and domination worldwide of international retail food chains. It's remarkable what's happened almost overnight across the world, in the sense that what's been true in Western countries for quite a number of years in terms of the importance of large supermarket chains has spread quickly across the world. First in Asia, South America, now the last frontier being Africa, wherein in many cases the same international retail food chains have taken over, effectively replaced the small specialty food retailers that had prevailed in those areas for decades, if not centuries. And as they do so, they're putting in place the procurement chains that they have, in essence, pioneered in countries like the US and Canada. There's no question that now the dominant players in the food chain, in the food system, are these international retail grocers. The facet of market power that we're concerned about increasingly is the power of intermediaries as buyers, not their selling power to consumers, and that's a change. 20 or 30 years ago, there was a lot of people talking about milk prices that consumers were facing, ready-to-eat breakfast cereals being too expensive to consumers. That seems to have died out. But the policy focus is on downstream intermediaries' power as buyers over farmers. And a lot of activity in my home country, and I know to some extent here as well, is based upon dealing with this market power, or concerns about this market power of downstream intermediaries and its impacts on farmers. Part and parcel of what's going on now has been the decline of so-called spot or cash markets. The statistics for the U.S., and I apologize, I don't know the exact facts and figures for Canada. 40% of U.S. production is now via contract, and in many key industries it's almost 100%. So chickens for broilers is about 100%. Hogs, almost overnight, over about a 20 or so period, went from being basically a cash market commodity to now where the cash market is only a few percent, and the entire rest of the industry is either under processor vertical integration or very rigid contracts linking the processors and the growers. In addition to that contract production, a lot of downstream intermediaries are integrating themselves into food production, which of course is the ultimate form of vertical control. There's no question that there are efficiency gains to be had for this. One, I think, well-done study in the U.S. showed that there were 20% efficiency gains for contract hogs relative to hogs raised without any vertical coordination and sold via the spot market. So this type of coordination is an emergence, is emerging in response to the market's ever greater demands for different dimensions of product quality, consistency, and safety. What the economists call information problems of adverse selection and moral hazard that could occur without any coordination can be solved and addressed through these types of coordination mechanisms, but nonetheless, it's been of great policy concern. Much of the concern about competition in the U.S. farm bills, and there's another one that's just percolating now to its conclusion, has been about this type of vertical control in the agricultural industries, and we've come very, very close to putting the brakes on it in various farm bills. It's never happened, but it continues to be a source of great policy consternation as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and it's something that we should be regulating or attempting to control otherwise. And lastly, or not actually last, but in terms of my listing here, we need to think about how these very rapid advancements in technology are affecting our markets. So these technological innovations have what we call a capital bias. They've made the technologies for both farming and processing much more capital intensive. And these capital investments are highly specialized and constitute what we call a sunk cost. I mean, a cost is sunk if it's not recoverable, if it's not retrievable. You put in place a processing plant in a location to process a particular commodity, that's a sunk cost. You're never recovering that cost if for some reason you decide to leave that industry. But what it means then is that the market participants at all stages have a long-run commitment to the market. And I'm soon going to, in this presentation, want us to think about what that fact implies for downstream intermediaries' incentives to exercise market power, even if they have the potential to do so. And finally, in terms of changes that we've observed in our agricultural sector, is the emphasis on freer trade. In Western economies, the main opportunities for growth is growth in population, which is typically about 1%, and it's not enough to accommodate the growth in output that just happens due to technology, better yields, and so forth. So increasingly, our industries are having to look beyond the borders to market their relentlessly growing production. It's also, from a world scale, considered to be the pathway to development for less developed countries, so trade negotiations have been focusing on that. So there's no question that the political pendulum has swung in favor of freer trade. Now, so in light of this, how does our conventional wisdom about agriculture fare in these MAM, modern agricultural markets? Do we have a market power problem? Well, on the surface, the evidence would certainly say that we do. Processing and retailing are what the economists would call structural oligopolies or oligopsonies. Even the data that's presented to us on levels of concentration at national levels understate what it really is in the markets that matter, because for most procurement markets for agricultural products, the relevant market is subnational. It's a local or regional market because of the perishability of the product and its difficulty in transportation. In addition, the entry barriers are high due to these large sunk capital investments that I was talking about earlier. And these firms compete in an environment where day after day, year after year, they're competing with the same sets of firms over and over again. When we hear these textbook claims that any types of cartel or collusive agreements are inherently unstable because firms would have an incentive to cheat on them, that's only true in a simple, static, or one-shot environment. When competition is long-lived with no ending period, those results aren't true anymore. You can sustain a collusive or a cooperative environment in those types of situations. And so if you presented this structure to an economist who specialized in these types of competition issues, that economist would surely say, you've got a problem. You've got a market power problem in this type of a setting. But there's been a lot of empirical studies by agricultural economists, some of whom are in this room. I've done some myself, and they tend not to find much market power. And they tend to find that the efficiency benefits from consolidation, essentially economies of scale, exceed any negative impacts from market power. But yet, the recurring refrain, if you talk to producers, and in a very, very well-known situation in the U.S. a couple of years ago, the U.S. Justice Department and the U.S. Department of Agriculture went on a set of listening sessions across the country and talked specifically in different parts of the country growers of different commodities, focusing primarily on meat products and dairy. And the recurring theme and complaint was a lack of competition on the part of producers for people to procure their products. Many well-stated quotes saying, only one firm is here willing to buy my product. And I'm going to very shortly present a little theory that I think can put all of this in perspective and explain it. But suffice it to say that a lot of our public policies and regulations have been put into place premised on beliefs that buyers had substantial market power, and unless we reined them in, they would exercise it. Here is a quote from the U.S. Government Accounting Office, and I guess if there's an entity in the U.S. that's considered to be relatively unbiased, it might be this entity. And they were asked by Congress to do a meta-study on this issue of market power in agriculture, and there's their money quote, so to speak, so that they looked at the industries where we had the biggest concerns: meat processing, dairy, and retailing, and they concluded that they didn't find much evidence of market power, and they found that the efficiency effects were larger than the market power effects. So that's just one conclusion, but it's a conclusion that I think is true from my own examination of this literature, so that we've got, in essence, a paradox, right? We've got markets that look like they're structurally would have a lot of market power, but yet at the end of the day, people aren't finding it. The theory I want to propose to you now is that when we think about this, we haven't really considered fully the needs of the downstream buyers, processors, retailers. I've talked to lots of processors in my day, and I've read what others are saying, and the single most important facet for them, for the profitability of their operations, is to operate at a full capacity or an efficient capacity for as long as they can. So in terms of, for example, processing tomatoes, which is a huge industry even in my area of California, the processors seek to operate those plants for at full capacity for as long of a window of time as they can, including incentivizing farmers to produce for very early and very late market windows, which, particularly with the late market window, can be very risky because if you get rains at the wrong time, the crop would be destroyed. But it's so important to their profitability. And the same, in a similar vein with the retailers, what's important to retailers, they'll tell you, is that they have a set of suppliers who can reliably supply products in the volumes they seek and with the qualities they seek. So can you suppress farm prices by exercising market power in the short run? Well, because the short run supplies are so inelastic, so unresponsive to price, you're darn right you can. You could exercise a whole lot of market power. But what happens when you do that? Well, anytime you overexploit a resource, you diminish it. That's what the economists call tragedy of the commons. We tend to think about the tragedy of the commons in the sense of overgrazing open ranges, depleting fisheries, but is it really any different when you're talking about a processing plant located in an area of production, whereby if by exercising that market power, the processing plant drives farmers out of production because they can't earn a sufficient return, and drives them out in a way that they're not coming back because these costs, these investments are sunk. Once you exit, there's going to be barriers to returning, okay? So under this theory, processors and handlers need to find and retain a stable group of suppliers and need to pay them in a way that's going to keep those suppliers profitable and in the industry. But they don't have incentives to compete for outside suppliers. If you, through contracts, have signed up enough production to operate your your processing plant efficiently, to stock your retail shelves at the levels you seek, then you're not going to go out and seek to compete to acquire more suppliers. So when the farmers tell the Department of Justice or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, nobody's competing to get my product, it's understandable. It's understandable in that context, but the essential thing is that if you are an efficient producer and you're able to get a contract, you're able to have a relationship with a supplier, that's going to be a symbiotic relationship under this setting, and the supplier's incentive, not due to any niceness or benevolence, but the buyer's incentive is going to be to make sure the suppliers are paid sufficiently to be profitable and to remain in business. Price stability, that's a traditional element that we've thought is important to our agricultural policies and regulations. Certainly it's cited as a key advantage of the Canadian supply management programs. When I hear complaints about volatile prices in the US, it's when they're low. So volatility is used as a euphemism for low prices in some sense. But some of the most successful agricultural industries in the US are industries that have the most volatile prices, and you hear almost no complaints. I'll show you some graphs on that in a bit in the presentation. And so one of the questions I would ask relative to, say, earlier times when some of these policies were put in place is, do farmers in our countries, in our Western countries, the US and Canada, do they lack risk diversification tools to the point where price and income stability is something that we really need to focus our policies upon? From a consumer's perspective, same thing. Food's budget share for most of our consumers is no longer nearly as large as it was a generation ago. It's, as a matter of economic theory, consumers actually benefit from price instability. And if we hear consumers complaining about prices, it's only when they're high. And as I say in the last bullet, retail prices today, due to the power of the retailers, bear little relation to the farm prices. I've done many studies for many commodities. The correlation between prices at the farm and prices at retail is almost nil. So even if we succeed in stabilizing prices at the farm, or we don't, it's going to bear little relation to the prices that consumers pay. So one of my major points, I think, is that we should worry less in setting our policies and enacting our regulations about price and income stability than we did before, because I think it matters less to both farmers and consumers than it would have a generation or so ago. But unquestionably, agriculture remains important to the national interest. When I was a student, it was national security arguments, fears that during periods of strife or wars, international trade in food would break down and we wouldn't have a supply. I don't hear those arguments raised today. Rather, it's the importance of agriculture to the vitality of rural areas. I give a quote here from a USDA official. This came to the forefront a couple of years ago when the branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, known as GIPSA, the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration, suddenly promulgated a very draconian set of regulations to regulate all product procurement for more or less all important forms of livestock in the U.S., cattle, hogs, and chicken. And these regulations were, for most economists, their worst nightmare in terms of the inefficiencies it seemed that they would put in place on the market. So it was the USDA's attempt, effectively the Obama administration's attempt, to put the brakes on this vertical coordination that I was describing to you earlier that was proceeding very rapidly in these industries. And you see here from the quote what the justification was. This was from testimony by this gentleman before the U.S. Congress, why they were doing it. This is why they were doing it. They didn't think that it was going to make these markets operate more efficiently. They thought it was going to preserve these industries and the vitality of rural America. And if that's true, and I think it is to certainly a certain extent, I don't know how you argue with that rationale. I don't know how you argue with it, and I don't know how you value it and put a money figure on it. Certainly the economists could have come in, and I did some of this work myself at the time, came in and pointed out the efficiency costs that would be borne if these regulations were put in place. Now, Congress ultimately precluded the USDA from spending money to put these regulations in place, so they're on hold. But their whole rationale was this rural vitality rationale. In terms of optimally regulating our agriculture, a key question is who should do it. And I want to talk a little bit about that now. I'm going to propose to you here on this slide 5 levels of regulation that we can think about. And the first one is probably not something we even tend to think about as a regulation. But that's indeed exactly what buyer-imposed standards are. So when we are having contract agriculture, as is now really proceeding apace, I think, throughout agricultural economies, what it is, it's a form of regulation. It's downstream buyers, whether it's processors or retailers, imposing regulations on how the product is grown. Another form of regulation that maybe we don't think about it in that context is cooperatives. Both Canada and the US have a long history of marketing cooperatives. It's voluntary, just the same way that buyer-imposed standards are voluntary in the sense that you don't have to sign the contract with that buyer if you don't want to. Of course, if you don't sign it, you might not have a selling opportunity. But with voluntary collective action through cooperatives, when you join in that type of an arrangement, you're agreeing on marketing channels for the product, ways of promoting the product, and so forth. So that's a way of doing regulation through that type of voluntary collective action. It's subject to a lot of limitations, as I'm about to discuss, so that leads us to mandatory collective action at the industry level, namely industry marketing boards. They go under different names, but it's the idea of letting industries self-regulate. And I'm going to want to contrast the US and Canadian models for doing that. Certainly then, at the next level, we have the state and the provincial governments imposing their own sets of regulations. I'm going to argue that there's almost no circumstance when that level is the appropriate level to be regulating agriculture. And then finally, we have the national or the federal governments. So let me expand on these points a little bit. With buyer standards, that's what the vertical control in modern agricultural markets is all about. Downstream buyers regulating their upstream suppliers through contracts. So those contracts are going to emphasize inputs that a producer is precluded from using. You can't use a product that contains GMOs, pesticides, other inputs. Or it's going to be the requirement that you do use certain inputs. In some cases, these inputs are going to be provided directly for you by the downstream buyer or even applied by the downstream farmer. Increasingly in the US, and I think it's going to be spreading worldwide, are concerns about the treatment of farm animals. So major buyers in the US are now saying they're not going to buy pork products from hogs raised with gestation crates. They're not going to buy eggs from chickens raised in crates that are not sufficiently spacious and roomy. Again, I think the new frontier of this is going to be the treatment of farm workers or low-income farmers. And interestingly, as I've said, the U.S. response to this policy has been to seek to substantially reduce it through regulation, to preclude these types of vertical control, especially in livestock. It seems not to have succeeded so far, but attempts continue. Attempts in the Farm Bill, attempts with those GIPSA regulations. Now, marketing cooperatives are an interesting entity because marketing cooperatives immediately alleviate our concerns about buyer power. If you're selling to a cooperative, you're selling to an entity that you jointly own, so you shouldn't have to worry about buyer power. So in that sense, cooperatives are a great response to concerns about buyer power, but the traditional policies of cooperatives encourage homogeneity in this market environment, as I've been saying, that increasingly demands heterogeneity. If you pool revenues, almost invariably, the revenue pooling is going to encourage an adverse selection problem, wherein low quality drives out high quality. I've looked at lots of revenue pools for lots of cooperatives, and you can have sophisticated revenue pools, but invariably that's an impact of revenue pools, because if the low quality product gets the same price as the high quality product, the incentive to produce the high quality product is attenuated. Either you don't produce it or you leave the cooperative. A failure to control production, one of the basic principles of cooperation, the so-called Rochdale principles, is open membership. If you don't control production in a market environment that increasingly emphasizes differentiated products and niche markets, then you're going to glut those markets and you're not going to succeed. So the collective actions taken through cooperatives are very often subject to free riding. I could show you many examples of US cooperatives that went and opened new markets, new products, new international markets. As soon as they opened them, others came in and took over the markets. So I do think, and I think the Canadian experience is supportive of this argument as well, that the era of large-scale, capital-intensive processing cooperatives may be coming to an end. But what can emerge in place of them are low-investment, limited-purpose cooperatives that can do things like allow producers to agree on a set of production standards and practices and then jointly certify their credence. These types of cooperatives impinge little on the marketing autonomy of their members, which seems to be an increasingly important thing for farmers. Farmers that I know and talk to want to compete. They want to differentiate themselves versus a generation or two ago when they viewed each other as colleagues and cooperators. Here's a slide. When I started teaching a class in cooperatives in California, about 20 or so years ago, I thought, well, I'm going to put together a list of cooperatives that are important California cooperatives so that the students will at least know that some of these major firms that they've surely heard of are cooperatives. Well, a little while ago, I went back and revisited that list and said, well, what's happened to those cooperatives on my list? Well, 6 of the 11, the ones that are in bold, are gone. They either went bankrupt, they converted to an investor-owned firm, or just withered on the vine and died. The other 5 are still in business, but they've changed in dramatic ways. In most cases, their market shares are smaller. Sunsweet, the major branded prune cooperative, is now procuring product from Chile instead of, in addition to the product that it's getting in California. And so, I mean, the same tale would be told in Canada with the grain cooperatives and so forth. So it seems clear that this form of cooperation and regulation is on the wane. An alternative to overcome that free riding that's inherent, and with outsiders in an industry free riding on what the marketing cooperatives do, is to regulate through marketing boards. So with marketing boards, we have mandatory industry regulation, and it overcomes that free riding. One question is, what's the appropriate level of jurisdiction? In both the US and Canada, we can have provincial or state marketing boards or federal marketing boards. A key difference between the US experience and the Canadian experience is that the US marketing boards are voluntary in the sense that they are enacted at industry request and put into place only if a supermajority of the producers, and if the handlers are part of the regulation, they have to be included in the referendum as well. So only if a supermajority puts them in place are they going to become law. Once they're put in place, they have the force of law, and they have elected boards that then conduct the business of the board, subject to oversight by the authorizing level of government, but they have considerable autonomy. And they can be removed by a simple majority vote. So in the US, most of them are reauthorized. They win those reauthorization votes, but nonetheless, entry and exit are common. So it's at least from my outsider's perspective, it's a fairly different model than what we've been seeing within Canada. they're not a major part of U.S. agricultural policy, which I think is in contrast to the Canadian situation as well. The U.S. will soon enough, we think, sign another farm bill. They're supposed to sign one every 5 years. In this case, it'll have been 7 by the time they get around to doing it. But there'll be nary a mention of these marketing boards. They're little known. They're mostly non-controversial outside of the industries they regulate, but they can be quite controversial internally within those industries because they require homogeneity in a situation when people in those industries seek increasingly to differentiate. What do? Well, the single thing that most of them do, or the most important thing, is generic promotion. But generic promotion is homogeneity. It's saying, buy California table grapes, buy California peaches. If you are a marketer or a grower in California trying to promote your own brand and type of table grape, you might not be happy that there's that generic message out there saying California table grapes are a homogeneous product. They're increasingly controversial. They do research. But increasingly the research is not on production, but it's on the nutrition and health dimensions of the products they produce, which is all part and parcel of this heterogeneity that I'm saying is increasingly important. Because if you can document through your research specific health claims and then market them to the consuming public, you're differentiating yourself from other competing products. Minimum quality standards, homogeneity. Is it appropriate or not? Only a very declining few engage in supply control. There's no supply control for animal products. It's only for perennial or annual crops. And the way it works in the U.S. is that there will be periodic crop diversions, not production quotas. Let me show you now 3 graphs that illustrate a little bit different stories of what these boards can achieve. In the first case here, I've got avocados in the U.S. Most of the avocados are grown in my home state of California, but what happened is about 1997, due to our free trade agreements with Mexico, Mexican avocados, which heretofore had been ruled out, not importable due to some phytosanitary concerns, which were probably bogus anyway, they came in a phased entry over about an 8-year period, finally removal of all the entry barriers in 2005. Over 2/3 of the U.S. Avocado supply now is coming from imports. And look at what's happened. The red line is the real price. So I've adjusted this for inflation. Well, for one thing, it's volatile as heck. But the other thing, if you draw a trend line through that real price, it's almost flat. They've managed to keep the real price of avocados basically constant over this period, while 2/3 of the supply has come in from imports. And how have they done it? Over that period, they've managed to more than triple per capita consumption. From less than 2 pounds of avocados, if you see over there on the right vertical axis is measuring the consumption, from under 2 pounds to over 5 now. They've done that by promoting the heck out of the commodity and by requiring the importers to join in that promotion effort. That required a particular piece of legislation. They got it passed, they created a board, and the importers are part of that. The other example, or a second example that I want to show you, is almonds. Again, it's a commodity grown primarily in my home state, but it's a situation where in the 90s in California, you could see all of these crops, this acreage going out of annuals into perennial crops, most notably almonds. And I was doing some work for the industry at that point in time, and so we could see these acres going into the ground, and our models almost perfectly predicted the increase in supply that was going to come as a result. Where we were completely wrong is predicting the price consequences. Almonds have a price inelastic demand as well, so our prediction was that the price was going to fall through the floor. Rapidly expanding supplies, inelastic demand. We were wrong. We were wrong because they promoted the heck out of the product and they opened new export markets, most notably in China and India. They were in China and India before it was popular to be in China and India. And you can see here that that production, which is on the left-hand axis, that production has increased over that relatively short, less than 20-year time period, more than fourfold. But yet that price, if you draw a trend line through that, that's going to have a rising trend. Volatile as heck, they don't care. Volatile as heck, but trending upward despite that fourfold increase in supply. The last one I want to show you is from Cranberries. Cranberries have a federal marketing order. And I got a call in the late 90s from someone at Ocean Spray, which is the largest cranberry producer. And it was right at that time where you see that price going down from about $60 a barrel down to about $15 a barrel over a 2-year period. If you want price volatility, you got it there, right? Price going from 60-some dollars to $15. And they wanted help in figuring out what to do. Well, the problem was they'd been growing too many cranberries. You can see that from the blue line. Production was marching inexorably upward. It's a storable crop, so inventories had risen and risen and risen, and now we're casting a pall over the entire industry. Well, what did they do? Well, they put in place a volume control. That little downward blip that you see there, I'm not sure I have a laser on that, but that little downward blip that you see in 2000, 2001, 2002, that's volume control. Put in place just in that period of time, and it was just enough to draw down those industries and draw down those inventories and set that price on an upward trajectory, which lasted really up until the last couple years ago. They need another volume control now. They're reluctant to do it, primarily because in the intervening 12 or so years since they had the last one, Canadian production has become so important. Canada's obviously outside the domain of the U.S. marketing order, and they're afraid that, well, they're not afraid. I mean, they know that Canada would free ride on that volume regulation and benefit at their expense, so they're afraid to do another one. But it's an example where just a little bit of volume control had a very dramatic effect on improving this industry's fate. Moving on now to the states and provinces as regulators. Most of the U.S. states, I think, compared to the Canadian provinces, have stayed out of regulating agriculture. And with good reason. The U.S. has a clause in its constitution, the Interstate Commerce Clause, which really says you can't do that type of thing except in rare circumstances. Iowa tried to ban packer ownership of hogs or cattle when it wouldn't happen as a federal policy. A federal judge ruled they couldn't do that. Probably the most meddling state of all, certainly, is my home state of California, where it's just an arrogance on their part, but they think if they do something, then the rest of the world is bound to follow them and do it as well. So we have cap and trade. We have cage regulations for egg production. We don't have GMO labeling, but they're trying darn hard to get it. And I think we're the only place in the world whereby a private employer, namely farms, is subject to mandatory arbitration for farm worker wages. I'm going to argue that states and provinces should basically butt out of that type of regulation. But when we think about regulating in agricultural markets, whose welfare are we really thinking about? Because I don't think we can answer the question of optimal regulation unless and until we answer who are we really caring about here? Who do we want to benefit in these regulatory settings? And so certainly it's farmers, but the question I pose is which ones? I mean, obviously the ones that are directly impacted by the policy, we care about their welfare. But what about farmers who wish to enter production in quota-regulated industries? even if the regulation makes some small provisions for entry, it's going to be curtailed. The U.S. marketing boards can do nothing to limit entry. If you enter, you're under the jurisdiction of the regulation, but the marketing boards cannot keep people out. It's a big contrast. What about cases where the output of one industry is used as an input into another agricultural industry? The classic example for me is the U.S. and its grain and ethanol policies, manifested as both minimum ethanol use in fuel and as an ethanol tax credit. The run-up in grain prices has almost destroyed some U.S. livestock industries. It's been devastating for dairy. Even lesser industries, an industry that I've worked with is catfish. Catfish eat grain that's broadcast on the surface of the water. It just devastated that industry. So there's a policy put in place to say, let's benefit our grain farmers by having these ethanol policies that turn around and then devastate other agricultural industries. What if if it's a policy that's put in place, as with the quota policies, through high tariffs? What if that results in retaliation against other agricultural commodities? So we want to benefit farmers, but if we're benefiting one class of farmers, are we harming another class, and what are we gaining when we're done doing it? What about market intermediaries? Well, certainly we don't think about our policies being designed to benefit market intermediaries, but rather in many cases to curtail their power. But much of the recent research work that I've done has shown if the market intermediaries have market power, and again it's a question as to how much they have, but if they have some, that they can capture a significant share of the benefits from policies and regulations intended to benefit farmers. I point to the U.S. ethanol tax credit. The Wall Street Journal editorialized repeatedly during the era when that tax credit was in place that it was a tax credit designed with the primary effect of benefiting Archer Daniels Midland. I did some research with a couple of colleagues that showed that even if there was a little bit of market power there, if they just had a little bit of market power, they very likely were the primary beneficiaries of those policies. I'm not an expert on the Canadian quota policies at all, but what I read about them in preparing for this talk would certainly lead me to have similar concerns that downstream intermediaries, not the intended beneficiaries of the quotas, are in fact capturing a lot of the quota rents from those policies. Consumers, taxpayers, we seem to care a lot less today about the impacts of policies on food prices, as I've said before. The U.S. paradoxically subsidizes food consumption for lower incomes through our food stamp program that we now call SNAP, but then it enacts other policies that make food more expensive. The economists would almost always say that the better way to support agricultural incomes is through higher food prices, is through direct payments rather than higher food prices. Certainly, using higher food prices to support agricultural incomes is highly regressive. It's going to always cause deadweight losses, but maybe it's the politically easier thing to do. So, I turn now at the end to what I'm boldly calling optimal regulatory policies for agricultural markets. So, I'm going to list some core principles here. They're no one's but my own, but I think they might be principles that at least a lot of economists would agree with, and I might think at least that others would as well. So the core principles that I outline here are that the overarching goal should be to promote healthy agricultural economies. There's no question, if we're going to meet these daunting challenges that I indicated at the outset of the talk, we're going to have healthy agricultural economies not only in the U.S. and Canada, but in other parts of the world as well. And then the second principle, the one that we might not tend to think about so often, is that in general we should encourage and not discourage or prevent heterogeneity. Regulations, by their very nature, require homogeneity. you have to abide by a regulation, you have to do the same thing. So in general, regulations are going to discourage or prevent heterogeneity, which is the watchword to meeting consumers' ever-expanding preferences and to creating these niche markets where smaller farmers might be able to come in and enter and get a toehold on markets where otherwise they're precluded from doing so. Seemingly a non-controversial notion should be that regulations should correct market failures and not cause them. And then finally, in terms of those jurisdictions, those different levels of jurisdiction, private contracts, industry boards, states, provinces, federal, the regulation should be at the least aggregate level that's sufficient to correct the market failure. What's that going to mean in reality? Well, homogeneity versus heterogeneity. When is homogeneity the right thing? Well, an obvious answer might be food safety. Well, an extreme free market type could say, well, hold on. Let the firms decide how safe to make their food, but have strict liability. If the product isn't safe, people get sick, people die, they can sue the firm that made it. Well, that's naive in the sense that we know, many studies have been done, that if there's a food safety incident, it will spread far beyond the firm that caused it. It will infect and harm demand for an entire industry, or even related industries. In terms of consumers recovering damages, there's bankruptcy laws, there's limited liability. So food safety, we would seem to think, is immediately a spot where we want homogeneity. Quality standards. Industry boards in the US can set minimum quality standards. So if your product falls below that, you can't sell it. Is that homogeneity or heterogeneity? Is that homogeneity that we should seek? That an industry board should say, well, your product can't be sold? Well, maybe yes, because if it's a situation where the quality level can't be discerned by consumers, so it's subject to adverse selection, then the low quality will drive out the high quality and the standard makes sense. Generic advertising encourages homogeneity. It encourages consumers to believe that a whole category of products is the same. That's why generic advertising in the US, even though it's done by dozens of industries, is increasingly controversial because it encourages homogeneity, it requires homogeneity in a world that increasingly wants heterogeneity. Pooled prices do the same thing. If you have pooling, whether it's through a cooperative, through industry boards, no matter how well you try to do it, it's going to encourage homogeneity, it's going to discourage quality through that adverse selection problem. So, jurisdictions. Regulations should be harmonized when it promotes efficiency. That's the problem with states enacting their own regulations. It's axiomatic that if you put a regulation in place, people will seek to avoid it. And this avoidance behavior is inefficient. You're spending resources trying to avoid a regulation, whether it's moving out of a state that's doing it or other of the myriad of ways you can avoid regulations. It's a waste of resources, and the regulations should be harmonized when there's that type of avoidance behavior. You know, I had a hard time in putting this together and trying to think about this, a situation where the state or a province was an appropriate level of aggregation for a regulation. And I really didn't come up with much. In my view, California and Quebec's carbon policies are counterproductive. They're going to lead to avoidance behavior, and if global climate change is the issue that most scientists think it is, then it's a worldwide issue. Even California, as big of a state as it is, its impact on carbon emissions globally is minuscule. So it's a regulation that's put in place to make Californians feel better, but it's going to have real efficiency impacts on the industries that are affected, and many of them are agricultural industries. The same thing is going to be true with California's hen egg regulations and attempts to impose GMO labeling. It's not something where the state is the appropriate level of regulation. Also, then we shouldn't be using states or national governments to limit regulations through private contracts, which, as I've said, has been a big goal of the U.S. trying to rein in these types of contracts, unless there's a justification for when standardization is important. Quotas. Let me talk a little bit about quotas in the light of these core principles. Do they correct or cause market failures? Well, we put in place now government-enforced monopolies. The belief, I think, when they were put in place is that the alternative was market power caused by buyer monopsonies. I would question, as I did, whether that rationale is valid today. Are they enforced at the correct level of jurisdiction? If they're going to be in place, the correct level of jurisdiction should be at the federal government, in my view. To the extent I learned and understand these policies, there's a lot of jurisdiction at the provincial level. Do they contribute to a healthy agricultural economy and the vitality of rural Canada? Well, I don't have an answer to that. I've seen the evolution of U.S. poultry and dairy industries, and maybe it's a future that Canada would seek to avoid. U.S. poultry now is entirely vertically coordinated through contracts, and the only thing growers do, the only thing growers have and provide is their own labor and chicken houses. Everything else, including the chickens themselves, are provided by the downstream processor. It's not a very pretty picture in most respects. Dairy isn't vertically integrated that way, but small dairies have been replaced by mega dairies. Maybe that's a future that Canada wants to avoid, and maybe it can avoid it with these types of policies. Do they preserve, are these policies preserving key agricultural industries or stultifying their growth? Certainly with dairy in Canada, we see competition from unregulated products. Soy products are now growing in response to dairy products being more expensive. People will always seek ways around the regulation. In this case, the easiest way around is to have non-dairy substitutes for dairy products. So what do we get in terms of growth of Canada's dairy industry compared to, on the graph here, we have growth of the US, growth in New Zealand. Canada's dairy industry hasn't grown at all. So in that sense, we're not contributing to a growing and vital industry. Do they harm other agricultural industries through retaliatory trade practices? And do they enforce homogeneity or support heterogeneity? Certainly, my look seems to suggest that they enforce homogeneity. There's barriers to entry for market innovators in terms of acquiring quota, either for production or processing. Certainly the case of Ontario chickens being a response to the local production phenomenon and wanting to raise and sell eggs that would be locally produced and organic, and not being able to increase those flock sizes above 100 hens without acquiring quota. Revenue pooling that's part and parcel of these things will create adverse selection. Let me say just a couple of words before I wrap up in terms of linking these basic principles to other types of regulations and policies. So, generic commodity promotion. Okay, demand growth is going to contribute to a healthy agricultural industry, and thus it's something we should encourage. It's going to enable agriculture to grow, it's going to enable rural areas to be vital, and if it's done at less than an industry level, there's going to be free riding. You're going to fail to conduct the optimal level of promotions. That's been the long-held argument, but there's few spillovers beyond the boundaries of an industry. So generic promotion would seem to be the key thing, where the proper jurisdiction is the level of the industry, but they promote homogeneity, not heterogeneity, and that's why they're under fire in a lot of U.S. agricultural industries. Going back to food safety for a moment, how do we apply these principles to food safety? Again, as I said, there's significant spillovers from food safety incidents. Entire industries are decimated when a single firm causes food safety incidents. In California in the last couple of years, we've had food safety incidents with melons grown in Colorado or Indiana, places where they probably shouldn't be growing melons, and the place where they should be growing, and can be grown safely, namely California, those industries were devastated. They were leaving the melons in the field because people weren't buying them because they thought they weren't safe. There's clear spillovers. The optimum level of regulation then cannot be achieved by private contracts, but can it be achieved at the industry level? Well, certainly it would have to be at the national level, right? It was Colorado and Indiana that was having these safety incidents, but certainly it might well be contained at the industry level so we could let industries handle food safety. If the states and the provinces implement conflicting standards and regulations, it will lead to these problems of avoidance behavior. So food safety, it's either got to be done at the industry level if that internalizes a spillover, or at the national level. So my point is that I think you can take these principles and apply them to most regulatory questions and start to get some answers. So in conclusion, then, our challenges are great and the stakes are high. We need to get it right, but regulations designed for a prior era and based upon the conventional wisdom may not be appropriate in our modern agricultural markets. I think there's some basic economic principles that I've tried to set forth today that can guide regulatory policy in modern agricultural markets, and the question then is whether we have the political will to follow them, and I certainly have my doubts that we do, but the best we can do is get these things out here in the domain and have them be talked about and see to where they lead us. And so I hope in some small way I've been helpful in that regard, and I thank all of you.